Hadith said that the debt, national debt is at 1 trillion ringgit. Yeah. So can you elaborate? Are debt figures higher than the published figures?
Yes. I think I would like to confirm what Dr. M said. Indeed, it is above 1 trillion ringgit.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Fahad Ahmad. Today, me and my group will present about public debt, a case study in Malaysia. Okay, so research question of this paper are: what was the situation of the public debt in Malaysia from 1997 to 2017? Number 2, what was the effect of public debt on Malaysian taxation system from Mahathir and Najib last 5 years of leadership? And number 3, what are the implications of public debt to the future generation of Malaysia?
So, to know what is public debt, you need to know the definition first and foremost. Public debt, also known as the government debt, refers to all types of borrowing, that is bonds and other securities, of a country's central government. According to Prof. Taylor, government debt arises out of borrowing by the Treasury from the banks, businesses, organizations, and individuals. The debt is then in the forms of promises by the Treasury to pay to the holders of these promises in a principal sum and in most instances, interest on that principal. So public debt is understood as when the government expenditure exceeds far greater than the government's revenue. So therefore, many scholars agree that public debt is not healthy for the economy in the long run. Though alternatively, it is positive because since expenditure tends to lead to the rise of public goods and services, it increases the national economy and the flow liquidity of the money. But according to many scholars, as Cunningham explained, he claims that economic growth is negatively affected by the debt burden through its adverse impacts on the productivity of the capital and labor.
Okay, some authors say that the public debt have negative impact. And what is actually the positive impact of public debt?
Okay, so since many perceive that public debt is a negative consequence because you have to pay the debt back, as like an analogy would be given, according to Naim Akram, he mentions that paying down the debt is like fixing the roof while the sun is shining. Meaning, as you try to build your economy, there are things and other factors which will strike you as a consequence to you. However, there is certain cases where public debt is good if the government expenditure is based on public goods and services for the public, not to repay back their debt of the interest rates given. Wait, just a second, I need to add something as well. There is a statement that when heavy reliance on external debt should be discouraged. This is in the sense that public debt will only be positive if it's only dependent on internal debt. For example, Japan, although they have one of the highest public debt against their GDP, but they're still sustainable simply because they have control on the money when it's based on internal debt. Whereas Greece, they are in an economic crisis because they are heavily burdened by the external debt.
Alright, so right now we already know what is the public debt, but we want to know more about the public debt in Malaysia. Could you please explain to me, please?
Okay, referring to his question, I would like to ask you what was the situation of public debt in Malaysia from 1997 to 2017?
Okay, those are wonderful questions, and I'll be glad to explain. So the situation in Malaysia for the past 2 decades in the early 21st century was public debt in Malaysia, as to recap, was at its lowest in 1997 with the percentage of 31.8%. However, during the financial crisis in Asia, which affected drastically on Thailand, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia was handling its public debt differently. They weren't relying on the IMF. So what did they do? So firstly, what they did was Malaysia cut off its operating costs by almost 20%, postponing numerous infrastructure projects, and it also increased its interest rates to entice its investors. This added to the fact that exports were encouraged with many tax incentives, while imports were slapped with an increase in taxes. This led to the baskets of goods to be more favorable to Malaysian exports and less favorable to Malaysian imports. Thus, public debt has rose by 5% by the end of 1998, according to Budina and Fees 2015. So, now we've talked from 1997 to 2004. Now let's jump forward to 2017. So, to compare countries, the neighboring island of Singapore to Malaysia, Malaysia is doing quite well in terms of their public debt, as compared to the Singapura, which they stand as about 112%, and Canada at 92.3% of their public debt. However, it must be mentioned that these countries spend far less to service their debt. As the aforementioned problem, the main reasons why Malaysia's interest rates in borrowing was high is because of the low government revenue and the interest payments, which puts Malaysia as an A-rated in comparison to Singapore's AAA rating. Singapore thus borrows at a far lower percentage than Malaysia. Another concern is the government payments to help state firms pay up loans which they could not, as mentioned previously. These are not recorded in the budget statements and are considered under other items such as other payments. The concerns of transparency with billions of dollars used is the main concern for Malaysia nowadays. That is 1MDB.
Alright, may I ask you one more question?
Okay.
What was the effect of public debt on Malaysia taxation system for Mahathir's and Najib's last 5 years of leadership?
Okay. Alright, cool. That's a cool question. Well, basically, Najib and Mahathir, they're like the sun and the moon. Think of Mahathir as the sun, he gives brightness, whereas Najib is very dark and sad. I'm not exaggerating, literally. Because in 1999, Mahathir introduced a tax-free year for all income earners, and they would not be taxed, thus affecting the direct and indirect taxation of Malaysia. Whereas Najib, in his time, he introduced the GST, the Goods and Services Tax. This is a form of a VAT, a value-added tax, which thus puts burden more on both consumers and producers of the nation to pay more of what they demand because of the supply. Therefore, Najib and Mahathir's time, they're completely different, and they both had their own consequences. Oh, hello. So now we know what happens during the past 2 decades of Malaysia's public debt and the tenureship of its taxation system during Mahathir's time and Najib's time. So what are the implications for the future generations of Malaysia? Follow me. So now, Malaysia has a new government, a new wave to change the current economic crisis or problems they're facing. With the new budget 2019, they have introduced the implementations of a new taxation system by replacing the GSTs with the new SSTs, the Sales and Services Tax. Some would say from the previous government that this isn't good. However, I beg to differ, because the SSTs has a lot of goods and products that are tax exempted by these SSTs in comparison to the GSTs. So what this means is that when tax certain goods and products are being exempted by these taxes, consumers and the people are not burdened as much as they were before. The GSTs were limited by a couple hundred of products and produces which were exempted, whereas the SSTs, a couple of thousand, were exempted, thus making the citizens have the leverage to purchase more goods and services. So this, the reason why the new Malaysian government has a new budget for the 2019 is because of the issues and the controversies of the 1MDB. Reason why 1MDB is highly controversial is because Lim Guang Eng mentioned that the total public debt of Malaysia has a gross sum of 1 trillion ringgit. That is far, far bad in numbers for the Malaysian public debt. So, in theory, this has a negative consequence onto the future Malaysian taxpayers, because to repay these debts, they must have the revenue. How? Taxation. That is one of the major forms of government revenue in any types of country. So, in conclusion, and as a recap, I've discussed what public debt is by explaining that whenever there is a budget deficit, by having more expenditure than the revenue. And I'll also mention about the case and the situation of public debt in Malaysia for the past 2 decades, from 1997 to 2017, and what were the situations that occurred during Najib's and Mahathir's time, and what could be the possible future implications of the Malaysian citizens with their current public debt. Thus far, in a nutshell, public debt has shown that the implications to it in future Malaysians could be detrimental, but it is still inconclusive due to the fact that there is still stability within Malaysia's public debt. Nonetheless, future scholars and economists would like to know further and forecast where Malaysia would lead in the next 10 or 20 years. Thank you very much. I'm Syed Sadid, and this was a project video. Good night.